There is something strange about the human brain. It weighs only a little more than a kilogram, takes up a small fraction of the body, and yet it is one of the most expensive organs we possess. Even while we are resting, the brain demands a remarkable share of our energy. From an evolutionary point of view, that makes it a difficult organ to explain. Natural selection does not simply make animals bigger, stronger, or smarter whenever those traits seem useful. Every biological advantage has a cost. Larger muscles require more food. Larger bodies take longer to grow, and larger brains are especially demanding because nervous tissue must be supplied with energy continuously. So why did evolution produce an animal like us? Our distant ancestors did not begin with anything resembling the modern human brain. Several million years ago, early hominins had brains much closer in size to those of other apes. Across the long history of human evolution, brain volume increased dramatically. Although not smoothly and not in a simple straight line, different hominin species appeared, survived for hundreds of thousands of years, and disappeared. Some had relatively small brains, others carried much larger ones. Within several branches of the genus Homo, brain size increased independently over time. Something was making expensive brains worth maintaining. But what? For a long time, the obvious answer seemed to be intelligence. Perhaps larger brains allowed our ancestors to solve harder problems, make better tools, remember more information, or understand the intentions of other members of their group. But that explanation immediately creates another question. Why did our ancestors suddenly need so much intelligence? Chimpanzees survive with smaller brains. Gorillas survive with smaller brains. Thousands of highly successful mammal species survive without anything remotely resembling the human brain. Evolution does not reward intelligence simply because intelligence is impressive. A larger brain would only spread through a population if the advantages it provided repeatedly outweighed its enormous biological costs, and those costs were substantial. A bigger brain required more energy. It required changes in growth and development. Human children eventually came to spend unusually long periods dependent on adults while their brains continued developing. Reproduction, food acquisition, cooperation, and even the way energy was distributed through the body all became connected to the problem of supporting this increasingly expensive organ. This means that the evolution of the human brain was probably not caused by one sudden breakthrough. There was no single moment when an ancestor became intelligent and everything changed. Instead, brain expansion appears to have emerged from a long interaction between environment, food, learning, cooperation, technology, metabolism, and culture. And even today, scientists do not agree on one simple explanation for why it happened. The fossil record shows us the result. Over millions of years, members of the human lineage eventually developed brains several times larger than those of the earliest hominins. But fossils cannot tell us directly what those brains were thinking. To understand why they grew, we have to reconstruct the world around them. The problems they faced, the food they could obtain, the relationships they depended on, and the extraordinary amount of energy that had to be found to keep a larger brain alive. And that story begins long before the first truly large human brain appeared. The first thing to understand is that the human brain did not become large all at once. For millions of years, our ancestors lived with brains that were much smaller than ours. Early Australopithecines, which lived in Africa several million years ago, had brain sizes that overlapped considerably with those of modern great apes. They were already walking upright, using their hands in increasingly flexible ways, and adapting to changing environments, but they had not yet developed the enormous brains that would later characterize our genus. The major shift began gradually with early members of Homo. Species such as Homo habilis and later Homo erectus generally show larger cranial capacities than earlier Australopithecines. But even here, the story is not simple. There was wide variation between species and individuals, and brain enlargement happened over a very long period. This matters because it tells us something important. Walking on two legs came first. The human lineage became bipedal long before it developed a modern-sized brain. For a long time, scientists once imagined human evolution as a kind of ladder. First an ape-like ancestor, then upright walking, then bigger brains, then tools, then modern humans. The real history is far messier. Different traits appeared at different times. Some species walked upright while still having relatively small brains. Some made tools without possessing anything close to the brain size of modern humans. Several hominin species existed at the same time, each following its own evolutionary path. So brain expansion was not the beginning of human evolution, it was one development inside a much larger process. And once that development began, it created new biological problems. A larger brain requires more glucose and oxygen. It needs a reliable supply of nutrients. It is also extremely sensitive to interruptions in energy supply. In modern humans, the brain represents only a small percentage of total body mass, yet it consumes roughly 1/5 of the body's resting energy expenditure. That is an extraordinary investment. For an adult living in a modern environment with regular meals, this may not seem dramatic. For an early hominin living in a landscape where food could disappear with the seasons, where drought could reduce plant resources, and where meat was difficult and dangerous to obtain, the cost of maintaining more brain tissue would have been much more serious. Natural selection, therefore, faced a trade-off. A larger brain could only be favored if it helped individuals obtain enough advantages to compensate for its cost. Perhaps it helped them find higher quality foods. Perhaps it improved memory of landscapes and seasonal resources. Perhaps it made cooperation more effective. Perhaps it allowed increasingly sophisticated tool use. Or perhaps all of these pressures acted together. This is where one of the most important ideas in human evolution appears. The growth of the brain may have depended not only on becoming more intelligent, but on becoming better at acquiring energy. Brains do not run on intelligence, they run on calories. And before our ancestors could afford larger brains, something had to change in the way they found, processed, shared, or consumed food. That change may have been one of the decisive turning points in the evolution of our species. One of the strongest clues comes from food. A large brain is biologically expensive, and an animal cannot maintain expensive tissue without a dependable source of energy. That means the evolution of a larger brain was probably tied, at least in part, to changes in diet. Early hominins did not all eat the same foods. Different species lived in different environments and relied on different combinations of plants, fruits, underground storage organs, insects, and animal foods. But as members of the genus Homo appeared, evidence increasingly points toward diets that included more energy-dense resources. Meat is one obvious example. Animal tissue provides concentrated calories, protein, and fat. Bone marrow can be especially energy-rich. Access to these foods could have made it easier to support metabolically expensive organs. Stone tools may have played an important role here. Cut marks on animal bones show that some early hominins were using sharp-edged tools to remove flesh and process carcasses millions of years ago. Hammerstones could also be used to break bones and reach marrow that many other animals could not easily access. This did not necessarily mean that early humans were powerful hunters from the beginning. They may have hunted some animals, scavenged others, or done both depending on opportunity. What matters is that technology allowed them to exploit food in new ways. A stone flake is simple compared with a modern tool, but evolutionarily it can change the economics of survival. It can open a carcass. It can cut tough tissue. It can process plants. It can reduce the time and physical effort required to obtain calories. And once tools improve access to food, a feedback loop becomes possible. A slightly more capable brain can support better tool use. Better tools can improve access to high-quality food. Better food can help support a more expensive brain. A more expensive brain can then make even more complex behavior possible. This kind of feedback is one reason human evolution became so unusual. The body and behavior were no longer changing independently. Technology itself began to influence which biological traits were advantageous. Another important idea is known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. The basic argument is that the body has a limited energy budget. If one organ becomes dramatically more expensive, energy must either increase overall or be reduced somewhere else. Researchers have proposed that changes in diet quality may have allowed the digestive system to become less energetically demanding relative to body size, helping make a larger brain possible. This idea remains debated in its details, but the broader principle is important. Our ancestors could not simply add a huge brain without paying for it. They had to reorganize how energy was obtained and used, and eventually, another development may have transformed that energy budget even further. Cooking, heating food changes it before it enters the body. It softens plant tissues. It denatures proteins. It can make chewing easier and reduce some of the mechanical work required during digestion for certain foods. Cooking can also increase the amount of usable energy the body obtains. The difficulty is timing. Fire does not preserve well in the archaeological record, and scientists still debate when habitual cooking became an established part of human life. So we cannot say that cooking alone caused the first major expansion of the human brain. But once controlled fire and regular cooking became common, they may have helped support the increasingly energy-intensive lifestyle of later humans. Food, tools, and brain evolution were becoming connected. And yet, calories alone cannot explain everything. If abundant food automatically created large brains, many other animals would have followed the same path. Something else was happening. Our ancestors were not only becoming better at extracting energy from the environment, they were becoming increasingly dependent on one another. The social world may have been one of the most powerful forces shaping the human brain. For many animals, survival depends mainly on finding food, avoiding predators, and reproducing. For primates, there is another challenge: other primates. Living in a social group means constantly tracking relationships. Who is dominant? Who is allied with whom? Who can be trusted? Who shared food yesterday? Who cheated? Who is angry? Who is likely to help during a conflict? These problems can become extraordinarily complicated. This idea is often called the social brain hypothesis. It suggests that increasingly complex social life helped favor larger and more capable brains in primates. Including the human lineage, a large group is not simply a collection of individuals. It is a network of relationships. Imagine living in a community where survival may depend on remembering dozens of different social histories at the same time. One individual may be a close partner. Another may be a rival. A third may be related to you. A fourth may have helped you before. A fifth may be dangerous when certain allies are nearby. The physical environment changes slowly compared with this. A tree does not suddenly decide to deceive you. A river does not form an alliance against you. But another intelligent animal can change its behavior depending on what it thinks you know. That creates a very different kind of evolutionary pressure. Social intelligence requires memory, emotional control, prediction, communication, and the ability to interpret subtle behavior, and humans eventually became exceptionally dependent on these abilities. Cooperation became particularly important. Our ancestors could acquire resources that would have been difficult for a single individual to obtain alone. They could share food, they could defend one another, they could care for injured group members, they could coordinate activities, they could learn by watching others instead of discovering everything individually. This last ability may have been especially powerful. If an animal invents a useful behavior, but nobody else can copy it accurately, much of that innovation disappears when the individual dies. But if knowledge can spread through a group, useful discoveries can survive. A better way to make a stone tool can be copied. A productive location can be remembered and shown to others. Information about dangerous animals can be passed on. Techniques for processing food can become traditions. Now intelligence is no longer useful only to the individual who possesses it. It becomes useful to an entire community. And this may have created another evolutionary feedback loop. Better social learning made accumulated knowledge more valuable. More accumulated knowledge increased the advantage of being able to learn. Individuals with greater learning capacity could benefit more from the experience of others. Over generations, culture itself may have begun changing the conditions under which natural selection operated. This is one of the most remarkable features of human evolution. Our ancestors increasingly lived in environments partly created by previous generations, not buildings or cities yet. Something more fundamental, a world of inherited knowledge. A young hominin did not have to discover every edible plant, every dangerous predator, every useful stone, and every successful technique alone. Others could show them. That changed what a brain was for. It was no longer simply an organ for reacting to the immediate environment. It was becoming an organ for entering a social system filled with information. And once survival depended increasingly on learning from other minds, the value of a larger, more flexible brain may have risen dramatically. But social intelligence may still be only part of the explanation. Another major pressure came from the environment itself. Human evolution unfolded during a period when African climates were repeatedly changing. Rainfall patterns shifted. Woodlands expanded and contracted. Grasslands spread across some regions and later retreated. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Familiar habitats could become less predictable over relatively short evolutionary timescales. For an animal specialized for one narrow environment, rapid change can be dangerous. But a flexible animal has another option. It can adjust. A more capable brain can help an individual remember distant resources, switch between foods, explore unfamiliar landscapes, learn new techniques, and modify behavior when old strategies stop working. This idea is sometimes described as the variability selection hypothesis. Instead of adapting to one specific environment, hominins may increasingly have been selected for the ability to cope with environmental instability itself. That would make flexibility unusually valuable. Consider the problem faced by a group moving through a landscape where water is seasonal. Remembering the location of a river is not enough. The important question is whether that river still exists during the dry season. A fruiting tree may be valuable only for a few weeks. A herd of animals may migrate. A drought may force a group into unfamiliar territory. The best survival strategy is no longer simply to know the environment. It is to understand that the environment changes. That requires memory, prediction, experimentation, and learning. These abilities may also help explain another characteristic of humans: our extraordinary geographic expansion. Members of the genus Homo eventually occupied environments far beyond the tropical regions where earlier hominins had evolved. Hominins moved into parts of Eurasia, encountered colder winters, unfamiliar plants, different predators, and new seasonal cycles. They survived without waiting for natural selection to redesign their bodies for every new habitat. Behavior increasingly became the adaptation. If it was cold, They could use fire, shelter, clothing, or social cooperation. If familiar foods were unavailable, they could process different ones. If a particular hunting strategy failed, they could change it. This is a crucial distinction. Most species adapt primarily through biological evolution across generations. Humans increasingly added another layer. They could adapt through learning within a lifetime, and learned solutions could then spread socially. This meant that biological evolution and cultural change began interacting more strongly. A brain capable of learning benefited from culture. A richer culture increased the advantages of having a brain capable of learning. The result may have been a self-reinforcing process, but there was a cost. A highly flexible brain takes time to build. Human children do not emerge from birth with a complete set of survival behaviors. They spend years learning. That prolonged childhood is expensive for parents and for the wider social group. Yet it may also be one of the reasons our species became so adaptable. Instead of being born with a large collection of rigid behaviors, humans developed slowly inside a cultural environment. The brain could be shaped by the particular world into which a child was born. Different foods, different tools, different social rules, different dangers, different languages, different landscapes. The same basic human brain could learn radically different ways of life. That flexibility became one of our greatest evolutionary advantages, and it may help explain why the story of the large human brain is also the story of an unusually long childhood. The evolution of a large brain created one of the strangest features of human life. Childhood became long. Compared with most mammals, humans take an unusually long time to become independent. Our children require food, protection, teaching, and social support for years. At first, this seems like a disadvantage. A species that produces helpless young and then spends enormous amounts of time raising them appears inefficient. But a long childhood may have been essential for building the kind of brain humans eventually developed. A complex brain needs time. It must grow. It must organize enormous networks of connections. And most importantly, it must learn. Human children are born into a world filled with information that cannot simply be inherited genetically. They must learn how to communicate. They must learn what foods are safe. They must learn how tools are made and used. They must learn social rules. They must learn who can be trusted, how conflicts are resolved, and how cooperation works. In later human societies, they would also learn stories, rituals, technologies, hunting strategies, navigation, and eventually entire languages. A longer childhood created more time for this learning. But it also created a serious evolutionary problem. Who pays for it? A child that cannot feed itself for years places a large energetic burden on its mother. And human mothers often care for more than one dependent child at the same time. This is where cooperation may once again have become crucial. Human child rearing is unusual because mothers are often supported by others, fathers, grandparents, older siblings, and unrelated members of the group can all contribute food, protection, and care. Anthropologists sometimes describe this broader pattern as cooperative breeding. The exact form almost certainly varied across different hominin populations, but the principle is important. Raising a slow-developing, large-brained child becomes much easier when the burden is shared. This may have created another connection between social life and brain evolution. Larger brains favored longer development. Longer development increased dependence on cooperation. Cooperation increased the importance of social intelligence. And social intelligence may in turn have favored greater cognitive capacity. The process could reinforce itself. There was another important consequence. A long childhood allowed young humans to experiment. Play is not simply wasted time. In many mammals, play helps develop physical and social skills. In humans, its potential becomes much greater Children imitate adults. They repeat actions. They test objects. They practice social roles. They invent games. They make mistakes in relatively protected conditions. In this sense, childhood became a training period for an unpredictable world. Instead of being born prepared for one specific environment, humans could spend years learning whichever environment they happened to inhabit. This was extremely powerful. A child born in a dry savanna could learn one survival system. A child born near a coast could learn another. A child living in a cold region could learn technologies and behaviors completely different from those required in the tropics. The biology remained broadly human. The knowledge changed. And this flexibility helped culture become increasingly important. But the growth of the brain also created a physical problem. A large brain means a large skull, and humans were already committed to walking on two legs. The anatomy of the pelvis therefore had to balance several competing demands. Efficient locomotion, the birth of relatively large-brained infants, and the biological limits of pregnancy. Human birth became unusually demanding compared with that of many other primates. One evolutionary response was not to complete brain growth before birth. Much of human brain development continues afterward. Human infants are therefore born at a stage when they still have enormous neurological development ahead of them. That makes them vulnerable, but it also makes them extraordinarily adaptable. The environment enters the developing brain through experience, language, culture, relationships, skills, and behavior become part of the developmental process itself. By this stage in human evolution, the brain was no longer merely becoming larger. Its entire life history was changing. Birth, childhood, family structure, cooperation, learning, and culture were becoming tied together. And once these systems were connected, another remarkable transformation became possible. Knowledge could begin accumulating faster than any individual brain could discover it alone. At some point in human evolution, intelligence began to do something that had never happened on this scale before. It began to accumulate. An individual can learn many things during a lifetime, but an individual also dies. If knowledge disappears with each generation, every generation must begin again. Human culture changed that. Skills, techniques, habits, and information could survive the people who first discovered them. One person could improve a tool, another could copy that improvement, a third could modify it again. Over many generations, the result could become far more complex than anything a single individual would be likely to invent alone. This process is known as cumulative culture, and it may have transformed the evolutionary value of the human brain. A larger brain was useful not only because it could solve problems. It was useful because it could absorb solutions created by others. That distinction is enormous. Imagine two populations. In the first, each individual must discover how to find food, make tools, avoid predators, and navigate the landscape independently. In the second, young individuals can learn techniques that have already been tested by previous generations. The second population possesses something more powerful than individual intelligence. It possesses collective memory. This changes the relationship between biology and culture. Once knowledge begins accumulating, there is more to learn. And when there is more to learn, greater learning capacity becomes increasingly valuable. A brain capable of imitation, memory, communication, planning, and teaching can benefit from a larger cultural inheritance. At the same time, richer culture creates stronger advantages for individuals who can learn efficiently. This can produce a feedback process sometimes described as gene-culture coevolution. Culture changes the environment in which natural selection operates, and biological evolution can then favor traits that make individuals better able to live inside that cultural environment. Tool making provides a simple example. The earliest known stone technologies were relatively simple compared with later ones. But over immense periods of time, stoneworking traditions became more varied and sophisticated. Producing some later tools required sequences of actions that had to be planned in advance. The maker needed to understand the properties of stone, control the angle and force of each strike, and maintain an intended shape across many steps. Learning such a skill from observation alone is difficult. Social transmission becomes increasingly valuable. Communication may have become more important as well. We do not know exactly when language in the modern sense appeared. Language leaves no direct fossil. The anatomy associated with speech can provide clues, and archaeological evidence can reveal increasingly complex behavior, but there is no single fossil that marks the birth of language. What we can say is that increasingly sophisticated communication would have made cultural transmission far more powerful. With communication, knowledge does not have to be demonstrated every time. It can be described. A location can be discussed before anyone travels there. A danger can be explained without being present. A plan can be coordinated before action begins. An event that happened yesterday can influence behavior tomorrow. Eventually, humans could share information about things that were not physically in front of them at all. That ability dramatically expands what a group can know. And once information can be shared efficiently, the group itself begins to function as a distributed system of knowledge. No individual needs to know everything. One person may know where water can be found. Another may be especially skilled at making tools. Another may recognize animal tracks. Another may remember seasonal movements across a large landscape. Cooperation allows these separate pieces of knowledge to become useful to everyone. This may be one reason human intelligence became so strongly social. Our brains did not evolve merely to think alone. They evolved in groups filled with other brains. And those groups increasingly contained accumulated information inherited from previous generations. By this point, the advantage of a powerful brain was no longer simply survival in nature. It was survival inside culture, and that may have changed the direction of human evolution permanently. The more knowledge humans created, the more valuable learning became. The more valuable learning became, the more biological investment in the brain could be rewarded. Eventually, our ancestors entered a world in which the greatest source of information was no longer the landscape itself. It was other humans. So why did the human brain become so large? There is probably no single answer. It was not simply because our ancestors began eating meat. It was not simply because they used tools. It was not simply because they lived in groups, faced unstable climates, learned to cook, or developed language. The most likely explanation is that several pressures began reinforcing one another. A slightly more capable brain could help an individual find food more efficiently. Better access to energy could help support more expensive brain tissue. Improved cognition could make tools more useful. Tools could make food easier to obtain and process. Cooperation could allow resources to be shared. Social learning could prevent useful discoveries from disappearing. A longer childhood could create more time for learning, and culture could preserve knowledge across generations. Once these processes began interacting, human evolution entered an unusual feedback system. The environment was no longer acting on biology alone. Behavior was changing the environment. Technology was changing access to food. Culture was changing what individuals needed to learn. And social life was changing which kinds of intelligence were most valuable. This may help explain one of the strangest patterns in our evolutionary history. For a very long time, our ancestors had relatively small brains. Then, across later stages of hominin evolution, several lineages developed substantially larger ones. Among some members of the genus Homo, average brain size increased over hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals eventually possessed brains that were, on average, at least as large as those of modern humans, and often larger in absolute volume. That fact is important. Modern humans are not simply the species with the largest hominin brain. Brain size alone does not equal intelligence. The organization of the brain matters. The proportions of different regions matter. Neural connectivity matters. Development matters. And perhaps most importantly, what the brain can learn from other individuals matters. A human raised without access to the accumulated knowledge of other humans would not independently recreate agriculture, mathematics, writing, engines, medicine, computers, and spacecraft. No individual brain contains modern civilization. Civilization exists between brains. It exists in communication, teaching, imitation, books, tools, traditions, institutions, and now digital information. Our greatest cognitive advantage may therefore never have been the size of the brain by itself. It may have been the ability of many brains to connect through culture. This also explains why human intelligence is so difficult to separate from social life. We think using concepts we learned from others. We speak languages that existed before we were born. We use technologies invented by people we will never meet. Even the questions we ask are shaped by knowledge accumulated across generations. In that sense, the evolutionary story of the human brain did not end when anatomically modern humans appeared. A new kind of evolution had already begun. Cultural evolution could move far faster than genetic change. A biological adaptation may require many generations to spread. A useful idea can cross a population within a lifetime. Technology can transform behavior in decades. Today, our brains are operating in environments that no hominin brain evolved to experience. Cities filled with millions of strangers. Instant communication across continents. Constant artificial light. Libraries containing more information than any individual could read in a lifetime. Machines that calculate faster than humans. Networks connecting billions of people. Yet underneath all of this is an organ shaped by ancient problems. Timed food, remember places, understand others, learn from the group, predict danger, protect children, cooperate, communicate. The human brain became powerful enough to produce worlds that evolution itself had never encountered before. And strangely, the long trend toward larger brains did not continue indefinitely. Evidence suggests that average human brain size has changed during our recent evolutionary history, and some studies indicate a modest reduction compared with certain earlier populations of Homo sapiens. The meaning of that change is still debated, and it should not be interpreted as evidence that humans simply became less intelligent. Brains are not engines where greater volume automatically means greater performance. What matters is how neural tissue is organized, how efficiently it works, how development unfolds, and how much information can be accessed through culture. That may be the final twist in the story. Evolution produced a brain capable of learning from culture. Then culture became so powerful that no individual brain needed to contain everything required for survival. Knowledge could exist outside the body, in other people, in tools, in stories, in symbols, and eventually in writing. The human brain became large because our ancestors faced a combination of energetic, ecological, technological, and social challenges. But its greatest achievement may have been something entirely different. It created a way for intelligence to escape the limits of one individual lifetime. A discovery could survive its discoverer. An idea could travel farther than the person who created it. And generation after generation, human beings could inherit not only genes from the past, but knowledge. That is the real power of the human brain, not simply that one human can think, but that humanity can remember.